Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all. Welcome to the fifth webinar of the Muslims in Britain Research Group at Liverpool Hope University. I am Salman al-Azami, its founding convener. This research group draws on cross-disciplinary research working collaboratively on various issues related to the challenges faced by British Muslims in 21st century Britain. The main aim of this group is to develop and share new ideas of research on Muslims in Britain, increase interdisciplinary research, identify areas of collaborative research, organize research seminars and conferences, and develop partnerships with major Muslim community organizations. Although we are based in Liverpool Hope University, our research group includes academics and postgraduate students in various disciplines and across different universities. In the globalized world we live in today, where there is a high demand for information sharing that goes beyond the remit of one institution in a nation state, we have decided to make all our events online so that we can reach people around the world who would be interested to listen to our talks and events. We intend to organize research webinars, roundtables, and interviews online and later upload them on our YouTube channel for people to access in their own time. We would appreciate moral support and constructive advice from our live and YouTube audiences. Please use the Q&A option here to post comments and ask questions. I'll go through them after the talk and our guest will answer as many questions as possible. Please note that the Q&A section will not be uploaded on YouTube. Let us now focus on our talk today. The title of today's webinar is The Embedding of an Islamophobic Trope in the Media, Radical versus Moderate Muslims. An aspect of today's talk features as a chapter in my recently published edited book, Media Language on Islam and Muslims, Terminologies and Their Effects. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Usaama al-Azami. Now, before anyone thinks how come we share the surname, I would like to say that yes, we are related. Usaama is my nephew, but I can assure you that nepotism has not played any role here. Dr. al-Azami is here in his own right, as his following short biography will confirm. Dr. Usaama al-Azami is Assistant Professor of Islamic Studies at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. He is the author of Islam and the Arab Revolutions, The Ulama Between Democracy and Autocracy, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. He completed his BA at Oxford, his seminary training at Al-Salam Institute, and his MA and PhD at Princeton University. He taught at the University of Oxford, Marquette Institute of Higher Education in Leicester, and Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam before taking up this current position. Usaama specializes in Islamic political thought. Without further ado, I'd now like to invite our guest speaker to begin his presentation. Yes, Usaama.
Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And thank you very much for kindly inviting me. And before this, of course, this is based on a book which I'm going to share on the screen in just a moment, if you allow me, inshallah. So this presentation is based on, this book, which you edited. Once again, thank you for inviting me and, several august colleagues, such as Salman Sayyid, Abdul Karim Vakil, also public-facing actors such as Mehrdad Versi of the Muslim Council of Britain, and of course, a lot of my colleagues, in UK academia and European academia, including Dutch academia, because I spent a year in the Netherlands as well, contributed to this book. So it's really an honor to be a part of something that you're sort of editing, but also alongside a lot of august colleagues. And I'm just going to highlight that I'm essentially doing a short version of this talk, which is the embedding of an Islamophobic trope in the media, radical versus moderate Muslims. So my presentation is in some respects a summary, if I can get this to move to the right place, if you just give me a moment, a summary of this chapter in the edited volume. As is always the case, these short talks tend to be a lot more concise than the actual original chapter. And so I will try and give a flavor of what's going on there, but I encourage people to try and get their hands on the book and try and read this. I think if you Google my chapter, it should be accessible online. So the actual proposal of talking about radical versus moderate Muslims was something which was part of the project. So this was proposed by Dr. Salman al-Azami, my uncle, and I was very happy to contribute to this. And essentially, one of the points that I make is that the term radical serves a very particular function in our society, in our political discourse, in our media discourse. And ultimately, it's about controlling Muslims, about disciplining Muslims and governing Muslims. I'm appealing somewhat, though I don't make this very explicit in the article, to Michel Foucault's conception of governmentality, the notion that modern states control their subjects in various ways. And these are deeply embedded in the way in which modern states operate. So ostensibly free societies will still have ways to discipline their subjects, as it were. But I wanted to start off by just highlighting how ubiquitous the term radical is when describing Islam or Muslims. So, these are some of the books that come up on Islam. Some of these are best-selling books. The one on the top left is a best-selling book by Jason Burke, a very noted journalist at The Guardian. And his book is called Al-Qaeda, The True Story of Radical Islam. But it doesn't need to be that sort of, it doesn't need to be post 9/11. Emmanuel Sivan's book is entitled Radical Islam. It's published, if I recall correctly, in the early 90s. I find this book, Routledge, respected academic press, very, in some respects, disturbing. It's called Radical Islam in the Former Soviet Union, and it shows 5 hijabi women who seem to be perfectly normal in a masjid, but that apparently is too radical for the author, or at least the publisher. I'm I've not actually been able to read that particular book, but the choice of putting something on the cover and juxtaposing it with radical Islam is something which clearly in the imagination of the publisher, one of the biggest publishers in the world, biggest academic publishers in the world, Routledge, and in the view of the author, is something which it will resonate with the audience that they're targeting, which is like an educated Western audience. And so this binary of moderate versus radical is a tool of securitization. And I'll talk a bit more about securitization in a moment. And, the construction of Muslim identity is taking place within the logic of the global war on terror. So the global war on terror is actually the context in which scholars talk about securitization. So let me very briefly actually explain securitization before I move on to the next slide. Securitization is the notion of evaluating and assessing a particular issue through the lens of national security. It could be assessed through through another lens. For example, we could think about mortality in traffic incidents in this country or in the UK. I happen to be in Qatar right now, of course, but in the UK, through the lens of health, the impact it has on the NHS, through the lens of sort of traffic policy, urban planning. But we can also say, well, actually, this is a national security risk. Let's consult the military or the security services to think about, and we can come down hard using policing to sort of like prevent people from, misbehaving on the streets. At the moment, a lot of this is not securitized. So, for example, if you're speeding in the UK, you might get a ticket, but you will usually go to a speed awareness course, and hopefully that will stop you from speeding in future. And it's only at a later stage that it might be seen as a relevant concern to the security authorities. But even that isn't done necessarily directly through the organs of the state, which are specifically concerned with national security. And so the issue about Muslims and radicalism could be understood through the lens of education. It could be understood through the lens of mental health, as it is very often done when it's so-called lone wolf attackers and so on. It could be understood as a response to foreign policy. So the foreign policy establishment could start reflecting on, what the CIA used to call blowback, the response to our own adventurism in the international arena. But rather than any of those choices, it is usually responded to through the national security state, and it's used to beef up the power of the national security state. And this is kind of the core critique that I'm leveling at the use of the term radical. The term radical is one tool in the arsenal of the discourse that is used to justify this kind of securitization of Muslims. And there is there's a role of public discourse, whether it's on the part of politicians, whether it's part of journalists, experts, media pundits, producers of film, media of various other kinds. They all play a role in manufacturing consent for Islamophobic policies. And so I'll talk about all of that, inshallah, or as much of it as I can in the next half hour or so. So one of the things that I contend in the piece is that Islamophobia, systematic structural racism against Muslims, is part of the political consensus in this country, whether it's on the right or the left. I'm talking about the sort of like mainstream right and left. Of course, there are in the extreme right, Islamophobia is embedded in the Tommy Robinsons of the world. In the sort of progressive left, Islamophobia is usually seen with great suspicion. But within the mainstream sort of more centrist right, the centrist right is kind of disappearing in a place like the UK, as we know from the last elections and the rise of reform. But even the centre left is kind of like centre right in many respects. But I've got a picture of Tony Blair there because he represents the sort of the governing left, shall we say, the centre left, and his sort of like successor in that tradition is obviously someone like Keir Starmer. And on the right, you have just almost all of the mainstream politicians of the right have this kind of Islamophobia is presupposed as a framework for understanding Muslims and Islam as a sort of global area of concern. And so I've got, we can mention, obviously, Donald Trump is back in office. This was originally written after Trump's first term had ended. And so in a sense, it looks a bit quaint now. I write, when Trump was in office, and now I'm reading the chapter again, and Trump is back in office. Quite a comeback for him. But he famously said, "Islam hates us," or "I think Islam hates us," in an interview with CNN. But more to the point, in a place like the UK, Boris Johnson wrote this after the 7/7 bombing. Sorry, I've got a sneeze coming. Alhamdulillah. Boris Johnson says this is after 7/7, he was, I think, the editor of The Spectator, and he wrote a piece where he said, to any non-Muslim reader of the Quran, Islamophobia, or fear of Islam, seems a natural reaction. Judged purely on its scripture, to say nothing of what is preached in the mosques, it is the most viciously sectarian of all religions in its heartlessness towards unbelievers. Now, I mean, this is, again, like the manufacturing, as famous sort of linguist and critic of US foreign policy, Noam Chomsky, has said the Bible is the most genocidal book in our canon. So he's talking about the Western canon. And he says the Bible is the most genocidal book in that canon. Anyone who's read the Old Testament, can recognize that immediately. If you read the amount of genocide that is advocated, and actually, to a certain extent, what we see in places like Israel right now in the context of Gaza, and Gaza is kind of like the big elephant in the room in talking about all of this. You'll recall, and the ICJ actually explicitly cites this at the beginning of the International Court of Justice, cites this when they make their preliminary sort of like ruling on the case of genocide, where they said, we are going to take on this case. And they say that there is a plausible risk of genocide. They cite as evidence the citation by Netanyahu of Old Testament references that are references to genocide in the Old Testament. And so, these sorts of, Muslims obviously recognize the sacredness of holy books that were given to the Jews and the Christians, or holy scriptures. but we don't, as a Muslim myself, of course, but Muslims do not recognize the accuracy of what we have in our hands as representative of that revelation. So that sort of genocidal sort of discourse that one finds in the Old Testament isn't something that we would attribute to a divine source. But in that context, it's extremely rich from coming from Boris Johnson, who's a very learned sort of scholar of the classics, and someone who would know the Old Testament, as literature at least quite well, to say something like this, to say that it's the most viciously sectarian of all religions. So that's one side of things, and then the other side is, liberal figures deploy the trope in some respects more subtly. And I also refer to a long legacy of liberal, genocide or liberal colonial genocide in the article, which is now well studied in the secular literature. And the media coverage normalizes this suspicion and fear of Muslims as well. So Tony Blair is a particularly, I think, sinister figure in the history of the securitization of Muslims in the UK, and given his role as the most powerful politician in the UK in his heyday, he also, and the UK, having a seat at the Security Council and being a very important international player as well, and he having very self-consciously tried to project the UK's importance further in the international system, it's not surprising that his models, including ideas like Prevent and other things, are ideas that have gone global in many respects. And I think, I talk in the article about various kinds of processes that take place through which the notion of radical Islam is constructed. So one of the underlying sort of conceptual frameworks I'm using in this article is social constructionism, very common in the social sciences, but the idea that our perception of reality is framed through conceptual frameworks, and the concepts that we use actually, to a certain extent, they articulate what reality is for us. And so to think about Islam as radical is not something that you can derive from natural reality. Religions are not like, natural phenomena like mountains and clouds and trees and rivers and all the rest of it, where they exist outside of the human mind in some real sense. But humans are necessary for the manifestation of something like Islam to become realized. And it's how Muslims think about these questions that shapes what Islam is. But also something like Islam is at the mercy of powerful discourse on the part of its enemies to cast it as radical or sort of moderate, etc. And so radical Islam is something that people like Tony Blair explicitly are guilty of, not just constructing at the beginning in the early 2000s, and after 2007, in 2005, that's an important moment of Blair's contribution to this and the rise of prevent legislation and so on. But ever since then, he's been constantly popping up in the media every 2-3 years, sometimes more frequently, talking, reminding everyone that there's a threat of radical Islam that we need to be very alive to. And he has his Tony Blair Faith Foundation, or Tony Blair, I think, Global Center for something. I can't remember now exactly the title. And all of these entities on a regular basis churn out, sometimes under the authorship of so-called Muslim scholars, they churn out material that legitimates and justifies these sorts of this ideological construction. And in essence, as I say in the paper, the way in which he characterizes moderate Islam is the sort of Islam that is willing to acquiesce to Western imperial ambitions on a global scale. So if you are willing to recognize the superiority of the West, the superiority of its values, the necessity of not resisting Western imperialism through your countries, the necessity of adopting Western economic models which are extractive and will extract sort of wealth from your societies and funnel them to the global north, then you are a radical. But if you accept all of those things, then you're a moderate. And that's how these labels have been constructed, and very perniciously so, as you can imagine. What's also interesting is that by describing radical Islam and moderate Islam, and he describes terrorism as a perversion of Islam, Blair basically becomes a theologian of sorts. So he's and one of the points that I make in the article is that, look, making judgments about what counts as religion sometimes might be necessary on the part of the state. If the tax code gives exemptions to religious organizations, then the tax code has to make a judgment as to what counts as a religion. So, sometimes that might happen. But what's interesting is, Tony Blair gets very involved in demarcating, and of course the security establishment does the same thing, demarcating what is legitimate religion and what is illegitimate religion with respect to Islam. So it's basically designating correct Islam against, al-Islam al-Sahih, which is in a sense the responsibility of the ulama, but they do this, they become arbiters of legitimate Muslim belief. I'd also point out that it's not just obviously people like Tony Blair, but it's also a discourse in other ways. And, I've kind of done a bit of a timeline. Here I've got a whole bunch of articles, a graphic from a series of Daily Mail headlines. It was a bigger graphic, and the ones at the bottom are a series of Sun headlines and Daily Express and all the usual suspects in a place like the UK. And it's through the constant production of this narrative of the threat of Muslims and the sort of like the fifth column of Muslims, and the fact that these people are likely to try and take over, and force you. Britain goes halal, but nobody tells the public. Christianity is under attack. There's a Muslim plot, and Muslims want to impose. Now Muslims demand, give us full Sharia law. They want to impose Sharia in Britain. This sort of narrative, and that's the media side of things. That's the print press. A similar thing happens with sort of audiovisual media. And of course, there's also film. There's a television series. My uncle has done excellent work on Bodyguard, which is, as a popular Muslim comedian in the US, once put it, like, Bodyguard, you can just taste the Islamophobia. Like it's so like thick in the air in that entire show. And this requires the complicity not just of a studio, but all the people participating in the construction of these sorts of media events, whether it's the actors themselves, the writers, the people who are doing, like, it's an elaborate industry, of course. So I mean, it's just something to bear in mind that there are multiple layers of how to how to create that narrative, as I call it, discursive construction. So the construction of that discourse. And securitization, removes Muslim political dissent from democratic debate. So you can, there are limits to what is legitimate democratic debate, and Muslims cannot fully participate in that, because if they cross certain lines, they're now labeled as radicals and they're no longer acceptable. And some of the ways in which Prevent has labeled that, basically, I've read Policy Exchange reports. Policy Exchange was particularly influential in the last government because it's a conservative think tank. Arguably was the most influential think tank over the last decade, maybe decade and a half, but in the UK. But Policy Exchange, in one instance, suggested that if Muslims believe that their own commitment to the Islamic law creates obligations upon them, then they are seen as a security threat. So if you believe, I mean, an implication of that statement, it's not made explicit, is that if you believe that you are obligated to pray as a Muslim, then you are an Islamist and potentially a radical Muslim, basically. So those sorts of things are actually embedded within our policy discourse. At least, there are influential voices that are trying to make that mainstream policy. And as I say, the conceptual architecture is built collaboratively by think tanks, politicians, and the media. And media, I've said, there's news media, there's sort of audiovisual and press, and there's also cultural media, so to speak. And this allows for the state to exercise extraordinary powers. Instead of the usual laws, terrorism legislation is brought in. And terrorism legislation is a very interesting and very sinister part of the global war on terror, because it basically eliminates normal rule of law. So you're no longer being just treated as a criminal, but you are being treated as regular laws do not apply. So you do not have usual rule of law protections. I'm conscious of just how much time I've taken, so I'm going to press ahead a little. And one of the texts that I use, the key sort of conceptual framework that I'm using, I have mentioned Foucault and I've mentioned securitization, but Manufacturing Consent is a famous book by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. And they basically argue that in democracies, in order for governments to maintain control, they need to use what they call a propaganda model to ensure the manufacturing of consent. And this is realized through 5 filters: media ownership, advertising, official source dependence, flack or criticism, and the use of official enemies. And all of these things, I mean, the fact that the media is in the US, they were writing in the US, and media is largely owned by business interests. And I've argued in my piece that even in a place like the UK, the BBC, it might not be owned by business interests, but they are very often at the mercy of the government, renewing their sort of license fee, maintaining their license fee. There are all sorts of levers that the government of the day has in place to be able to control and discipline the BBC. So the BBC, I mean, this sort of pretense that the BBC is free media has been given the lie by the last 19 months of genocide that has been systematically suppressed. And there's excellent journalism at this point by Owen Jones. A very extensive investigative piece by Owen Jones just explores the way in which Zionists have basically completely commandeered the BBC as an entity. And when it comes to Israel-Palestine, it is overwhelmingly basically a propaganda arm of Zionism at this point, and a advocate of genocide. And this is kind of again, I'm saying that I'm drawing on the propaganda model, even though it was developed in the United States. The BBC is a good illustration of how these are actually organs of genocide. And this is, I haven't developed this systematically. I'm hoping to write another piece, but a lot of people, occasionally in social media, they're saying, look at these media institutions, they're engaged in a complete dereliction of duty. And I actually don't see it that way. I don't think the BBC is engaged in dereliction of duty. I consider these to be the mouthpieces of imperialism. And so the BBC has historically, always been a partner to the British state in justifying its imperial ventures under the British Empire. And that tradition continues. Media are not supposed to be, this is kind of an extension of the propaganda model. They're not supposed to, because the propaganda model basically makes a similar argument. They're not there to keep an informed populace in a democratic state. They are there to make sure that the populace is is kept subdued from, and takes for granted the unholy alliance between powerful political interests and powerful economic interests and powerful other special interests in society. And so the special interests of maintaining sort of Western imperial domination in Israel, or supporting US imperial ambitions globally, is these entities like CNN, like BBC, etc., have been remarkably consistent in that commitment. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's by design, whether it's the New York Times. And, I really recommend in the context of the Gaza war to follow some of the people on Twitter, like Asal Rad. Asal Rad has just a constant, a feed where she constantly takes headlines from sort of Western news outlets like the New York Times in particular, and shows how language is very strategically used and very carefully used to prevent the genocide from looking like a genocide, to make it look like there's a sincere effort to try to prevent more harm than is necessary, etc. So as I say, like these media institutions actually, in my view, are doing their job and they're doing it very effectively. And we have to ask, like, how do we confront it? That's definitely a question that we ask, but I don't think we should be thinking, oh, there are some idealistic journalists out there who would love for it to look very different. But I always see these people as a vanishingly small minority, unfortunately. And power to them if they can bring the ideal to life. That would be great. Just very briefly, so advertising. I mean, when you have financial interests embedded, as Noam Chomsky once put it, like people have to recognize actually the news that you're being sold is not the product. You're buying the newspaper, but most of the sort of revenue that is being made by that newspaper is not from your purchasing it, it's from the advertisers. So actually, you are the product. The advertiser is the customer. They are paying the newspaper to buy you as a product. So they want to get your attention and your eyes. And therefore, like, some scholars have referred to this as a kind of inverted totalitarianism. Official source dependence. So the need for having access to official sources or governments or spokespeople of governments means that you have to maintain good relations with these people. And then there's flack, which is if you don't toe the party line of the establishment, you will be attacked and criticized and marginalized, whether by the officials of a government or other media institutions or various other kinds of institutions in the system. Think tanks will cast you as an enemy of the state, etc. And then finally, there's a need for an official enemy who, in their original articulation of this, they said, communism was part of one of the filters because you need an official enemy to scare your own population into submission, as it were. So you're saying we have to go after these people, so that justifies extraordinary means. And so the construction of a Muslim menace, requires this kind of like constant reproduction of these tropes. As I say, this embedding of Islamophobic trope. So Muslim rage, or Muslim violence, or Muslim terrorism, or Islamic terrorism, as it's sometimes called. All of this is part of, the construction of a narrative. Um, and one of the things I say is, you might say, well, radical Muslim does allow for the category of moderate Muslim, but the use of the term moderate Muslim is a capitulation to that binary. Because when you think about the average non-Muslim citizen, a British citizen, there isn't an automatic binary, the radical British citizen and the moderate British citizen. So as soon as you use this person is a moderate Muslim, you are already saying, as opposed to those radical Muslims, which he has, a genetic link to, and perhaps he's at risk of falling under the influence of. And so those sorts of realities are also, conceptual realities are very important to bear in mind. Okay, so I go in my paper into a bit of discussion of the judicial participation in the defining of Islam. So, the use of expert witnesses, and basically the state and its various organs. The state, of course, I think in the Montesquieuian sort of like tripartite division has the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. But the judicial branch, I looked at a couple of cases where a certain judge in the British judiciary, who's been quite important and influential in terrorism cases, was drawing on the expert testimony of a kind of Muslim in academia. So this person is basically someone who serves the interests of the security establishment in legitimating all of these anti-terrorism cases. And he famously managed to get a conviction, I think, against Shakil Beg, Imam Shakil Beg, for his, I think, I can't remember exactly the case off the top of my head, but that was a case of the judge and this expert witness judging a certain imam to be too extreme by Islamic standards. And Shakil Beg is a very mainstream imam in Britain, but he's someone who is vocal in his criticism of British sort of political persecution of Muslims and Islamophobia. And so that sort of, one of the things that happens is secular institutions then start becoming the arbiters of what is legitimate Islam and what is extreme Islam. And that's, in some respects, something to be quite concerned about. And finally, this isn't my final slide, but a point that I make here is the prevent legislation, which I was in university when prevent first came to university, and I remember, I mean, it made us all look over our shoulders and recognize, look, there are certain things that as a Muslim, if you want to advance in society, don't talk about. I, as an academic, I actually avoided studying the Israel-Palestine conflict because I thought, this is too dangerous for my own, like this is when I was a student in my 20s. This is too dangerous for my own sort of aspirations to become an Islamic scholar. I'm not going to touch that sort of stuff. But what does that do? In retrospect, now as the Gaza war happened and I started becoming more and more interested in these sorts of issues and recognized actually, like Muslims cannot be free until Palestinians are free. Like this is kind of the reality in which Muslims globally live. The end of imperialism and colonialism in a place like Palestine would be an end of colonialism, and would be a harbinger of the end of colonialism in other places as well. As the brilliant and incisive comedian from Australia, Amir Rahman, once put it, all colonizers see themselves in Israel, and all sort of, I can't remember the second phrase he had, but all freedom fighters see themselves in, someone perhaps can look that up and tell me, see themselves in Palestine. And so I think the reality is that institutions like Prevent, I'm just giving an anecdotal example of myself, by preventing me from, I consider Rizwan Sabra to be a friend. I've not yet met him, but we've communicated. He has a great book called The Suspect, published by Pluto Press. And it's a story of he, as a PhD student, being arrested under terrorism legislation and being targeted in a vicious way. And it's quite a harrowing story in many respects. But I remember seeing that story on the news when I was a student. That would have happened around 2007. I was near the end of my undergraduate degree. And telling myself, well, I'm not going to be going into those sorts of subjects because the risk against my own sort of like well-being is too significant. And so you ensure that you don't have the intellectual capital and the sort of the skills and expertise needed in the Muslim community to combat this through that sort of suppression. Even now, the average Muslim looks at the way in which people who are critical of Gaza's genocide will be attacked and viciously attacked sometimes, especially early on in the genocide. And they'll say, well, let me just stay silent about this. But it's through remaining silent that by suppressing the protest and criticism of current policies, that current policies are given a pass. And so I think, we need to be very conscious about the way in which these sorts of prevention policies, Prevent is the classic example of this, are ways of disciplining Muslims. And so dissenting religious or political views are framed as potential threats. And part of prevent is also to engage in thought policing. I mean, this is quite ironic for supposed liberal societies, but that's one of the things. You're not allowed to think certain things. To be honest, you're not allowed to. I mean, we talk about freedom of speech, but terrorism legislation can actually prohibit you from speaking about certain topics. Even academics like myself have to be very careful and circumspect about what we can say or not say. And this is again like one of the great hypocrisies of so-called Western civilization is that they embrace and they champion these values like freedom of expression, and yet in the practice of it, they are actually no different from any other sort of civilization that doesn't necessarily embrace that as a particularly important shibboleth to uphold as a value. And what's hypocritical about it, of course, is that they're claiming that they are advocates of freedom of speech, but there are a bunch of things that we can't talk about, or there are a bunch of things which, if we start talking about in explicit terms, we will be the target of, a government crackdown or security state crackdown, and that's all part of this. The term radical is a contributor to that reality. So I've already spoken a lot about Gaza, but let me make this my last sort of um, slide. I'm basically saying that um, the fighting of radicals is what is justifying the ongoing genocide, right? So when you have this sort of a term that is systematically articulated through the war on terror, the category is constructed, and a huge amount of discourse, literature, culture is shaped around this. When that happens, then you can have a society that goes and literally engages in a Holocaust on screen, being witnessed. I mean, I just was wondering sometimes that, like, what was it like in the Second World War? You'd hear occasional stories coming out. I mean, a lot of the narratives you hear is that after the Germans lost, and then they actually came to know what these concentration camps were, and that there were gas chambers, and that people were being starved to death or worked to death, etc., etc. And you can say, like, Europeans were horrified. I mean, Chamberlain was criticized for appeasement, the policy of appeasing Hitler, which obviously didn't work. And then, they came to realize this is what we allowed to happen, unbeknownst to us. Well, no one can say unbeknownst to us in this particular context. It's being live streamed. We know within seconds of it's happening very often. And so the only way it's something that the whole world can keep on watching and not do anything about. I mean, there are obviously multiple layers to this. One of the major reasons is because the most powerful state is the main perpetrator here. The United States is the main perpetrator of this genocide through its arming of what's effectively a sort of a military sort of like what do they call it? A forward military base in the region, which is also doubles as a sovereign state that the US recognizes. Incidentally, Palestine is recognized as a sovereign state by more than 75% of the world population. But the Security Council, which has the United States, the UK, France, and China and Russia, that is what prevents the acknowledgement of Palestine as a state, despite the fact that more than three-quarters of the globe actually has recognized it as a state, and most of them, the vast majority of them, have recognized it since 1948 or whenever it was. I mean, for decades. And yet it's not seen as a sovereign state, so it can't have an army, it can't defend itself, etc. And it can be laid siege to in this way by the United States through its proxy in Israel. And as a consequence of that, we can literally witness sort of a scale of devastation and genocide that I thought when we were talking about the Uyghur genocide in China, Amnesty International estimated 1 million people were being incarcerated in these re-education camps. And, the Chinese were very disciplined about what they let out into the global media. But, the difference between the Chinese, who have, I guess, a sense of shame, and the Zionists in Israel, who have, you know, absolute a sense of impunity, is that they literally go and advertise that we want sort of to ban humanitarian aid because our aim is ultimately to empty this land and colonize it through sort of our own people, and that's we want to ethnically cleanse. They are virtually saying, yes, we want to commit a genocide. And I think that is only possible and palatable through those two things. One is the discursive construction of the so-called Muslim threat, but the other is also, of course, the brute force and power of the United States Imperium. And so I think, this is in many respects seen as a war between Western civilization. And this is one of the ways in which Israel will appeal to liberals in the West. They're saying, we are civilized peoples trying to fight barbarism. That's always, Israel isn't as bad as Winston Churchill, for example, who orchestrated the Bengal famine, potentially leading to the death of several million people. These sorts of things are framed as, look, we have to protect civilization against the brutes, against the barbarians. And so I'll conclude here. It's a bit of a depressing place to stay to conclude, but what I say in my conclusion, in fact, if I'm given permission, I will just read like the final paragraph of my actual article, because it does give us some things to perhaps think about. One of the things I say is, indeed, as the French academic Olivier Roy has noted, the irony is that the terrorists have indeed been successful in forcing the West to change their way of life and abandon the freedoms they so passionately claimed to cherish. Yet to contest the story that major Western states and societies have told themselves under the malign influence of politicians like Tony Blair and filmmakers working hand in glove with the military-industrial complex, there needs to be a recognition of the propaganda upon which the mainstream narrative about terrorism is built. This is something that is undoubtedly going to be a struggle to achieve, but the gains of the past century that have helped render overt racism unacceptable, for example, are a mark of progress that illustrates the ways of seeing the world that are designed to dehumanize. Illustrates that the ways of seeing the world that are designed to dehumanize large sections of our society can be overturned with the appropriate and indeed necessary long-term struggle. Academics are perhaps a relatively minor part of this broader initiative, one which will need the development of an alternative cultural, social, and political discourse. Hence, everyone who opposes the systematic marginalization and effective dehumanization of Muslims on the basis of the intellectual architecture developed as part of the global war on terror, including the labels of radical and moderate, must join forces in our struggle to combat and deconstruct the dehumanizing narratives of the global war on terror in every sector of our societies. That's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Usaama. That's can you close the PowerPoint?
I will do that. Yeah.
So thank you. Really, I mean, how timely this presentation is. When you contributed in my book as a chapter, this was not there. I mean, when the book was published, after the book was published, or it's actually during the time, I think the book was published in October 2023, same time that the genocide started.
Yeah.
But in line of what's happening, how the radical aspect of anyone who is criticizing Israel becoming a radical and as being portrayed as radical is this. I'll come to one or two questions I have, but I think there are a few questions that have come from the audiences. But a couple of things that I want to tell everyone, the audiences, thank you everyone who have joined, is that there were a couple of questions someone asked in terms of how you can access the PDF of the article. I have shared the link of the book in the chat where you can click the link, and then all the chapters from the book, including Usaama's chapter, is there. Unfortunately, we can't share the PDF file because of copyright reasons, but the whole book can be very expensive. Academic books are extremely expensive, but you can buy the chapter if you want to.
I should also say that as far as I'm aware, usually, at least with journal articles, this is the norm. If someone writes to you and requests a copy of your chapter or your journal article, you are allowed to send it to them. So if anyone wants it, I'm quite happy to do that at my end.
With this, we'll stop the recording and we'll carry on with the question and answers.
Barakallahu feekum.